The story begins with the sun sinking low over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. A small settlement stood at the edge of Apache territory, where the fragile line between survival and destruction was often drawn, by bullets or by trust. Among the settlers was a rancher named Thomas, a man hardened by years of carving a life out of unforgiving land. His greatest pride was his young son Jacob, a boy barely 12, whose curiosity often carried him farther than safety allowed. One late afternoon, Jacob wandered near the mesquite thickets while chasing after a rabbit. A sudden rustle in the brush froze him in place. Before he could move, the hiss of a rattlesnake cut through the air. In a flash, the serpent struck, its fangs sinking deep into his leg. Jacob's cry echoed across the plain as he collapsed, clutching his swelling wound. By the time Thomas reached him, Jacob's skin was already turning pale, his lips trembling with fever. The settlement's doctor had little more than whiskey and bandages, neither of which could fight the venom surging through the boy's veins. The other settlers whispered grimly, without an antidote, the boy would not see the sunrise. Thomas, refusing to surrender his only child, remembered the tales he had heard, that the Apache medicine men carried knowledge older than the desert itself, cures hidden in roots, herbs, and chants passed from one generation to another. But asking an Apache for help was no simple task. Years of bloodshed had turned settlers and Apaches into bitter enemies. Many men in Thomas's settlement had lost kin to raids, and many Apaches had buried their own from settler bullets. To cross into their land uninvited was to risk death, yet watching his son fade was a greater terror. As night fell, Thomas saddled his horse and cradled Jacob in his arms. The boy's fever burned hotter with every mile. Guided by desperation and faint memories of an Apache campfire seen years before, Thomas rode deeper into enemy territory. The desert winds carried the howl of coyotes, and every shadow seemed to whisper warnings, but still he pressed forward. At last, the flicker of firelight appeared in the distance. Thomas dismounted and stepped forward, Jacob limp against his chest. Out of the darkness came figures, Apache warriors, bows drawn, faces stern. Thomas raised his voice not in defiance but in plea. "My boy is dying. I need your medicine, man." The warriors hesitated, suspicion in their eyes. Yet one figure, older with braids streaked in silver, stepped forward. He was the medicine man, the keeper of remedies. His gaze lingered on the child, then shifted to Thomas, as if weighing the worth of both life and honesty. And with that silent judgment, the true test began. The Apache medicine man, known among his people as Greyhawk, was not one easily moved by settlers' cries. His people had endured decades of broken treaties, burned villages, and stolen land. He had seen white men kneel in desperation before, swearing promises with tongues sharp as knives, only to turn their backs once their needs were met. But when his dark eyes fell on Jacob, he did not see an enemy's child. He saw a boy whose breath trembled between this world and the next. Greyhawk raised a hand, and the surrounding warriors lowered their bows, though their suspicion did not fade. Thomas sank to his knees, laying Jacob carefully on the ground. "I don't ask for myself," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I ask for him. You have the knowledge, save him, and I'll owe you whatever price you name." The fire crackled in silence as Greyhawk crouched beside the boy. He pressed his weathered hand against Jacob's brow, feeling the fever. His other hand traced the swelling along the snake's bite. The venom was strong, but not beyond remedy, if treated soon. Greyhawk glanced at Thomas, his expression unreadable. "You ride into Apache land," Greyhawk said slowly, his voice carrying both the weight of authority and the sharpness of memory. "You bring the son of the enemy. You ask for life when your people have given us only death. Why should I heal him?" Thomas met his gaze, his jaw tightening. "Because he is just a boy. He has never raised a hand against your people." His eyes softened, betraying the desperation beneath his hardened exterior. "Take my life if you wish, but give him a chance to live." The warriors murmured among themselves, some urging their elder to turn the settler away. Greyhawk silenced them with a gesture, He reached into the pouch at his side and drew out a small bundle wrapped in leather, filled with herbs and roots. He held it firmly but did not yet move to use it. "I will give you the remedy," Greyhawk said at last, his eyes narrowing. Then, his voice hardened like stone. "But I want something in return." The firelight flickered across his face, carving deep lines of shadow and mystery. His words carried not only a bargain but a test of honor. Around them, the desert seemed to hold its breath. Thomas, still kneeling, tightened his grip on Jacob's hand. He did not yet know what price the Apache would ask, but he knew the cost of refusal would be his son's death. The demand had been spoken. Now came the weight of it. The desert wind whispered through the mesquite branches as Greyhawk's words sank into Thomas's ears. "I'll give you the remedy for the poison, but I want something in return." Thomas's throat tightened. He had expected demands for gold, cattle, or even a rifle, but the medicine man's expression told him this was no simple bargain. Greyhawk's gaze lingered on the boy before rising to meet Thomas's. "For too long your people have carved this land, taking what was never theirs. You build fences where the buffalo once ran. You cut down trees that once sheltered our ancestors. If I save your son, you must give me your word that you will return something that belongs to us." The settlers behind Thomas, neighbors who had followed at a distance, shifted uneasily, their hands twitching near their rifles. They whispered among themselves, fearing what the Apache might demand. Thomas steadied his voice. "And what is it you want returned?" Greyhawk rose, standing, tall against the firelight. "Land," he said simply. "The strip of riverbank your settlement fenced last spring. That ground fed our people for generations. You took it without thought. Give it back, and your boy will live." The words hit Thomas like a bullet. That riverbank was the most fertile stretch of soil they had, the place where crops grew strong even in dry seasons. Giving it up would mean hardship for every settler who depended on it, yet refusing meant Jacob's death. "You ask for much," Thomas muttered. "I ask only for what is ours," Greyhawk replied sharply, his voice carrying the weight of years of injustice. The settlers behind Thomas erupted in protest. "You can't agree to that," one man hissed. "Better the boy dies than we starve." Another spat on the ground, muttering about Apache trickery. But Thomas's heart burned with conflict. His boy's breathing grew shallow, his skin turning colder by the minute. He could almost see the poison crawling through Jacob's veins, like fire. Greyhawk bent down once more, holding the bundle of herbs in his hand. He spoke softly, but his voice was edged with steel. "Choose, white man, land or life." The fire popped, casting sparks into the night. Thomas looked at his son's pale face, then at the circle of Apache warriors, their expressions unreadable. His chest heaved with the weight of the choice. He knew whatever decision he made would not only shape his son's fate, but the future of the entire settlement. Thomas's hand trembled as he brushed the hair from Jacob's damp forehead. The boy's lips moved faintly, whispering for his father, though no strength followed the words. The sight shattered any resolve Thomas had left. Rising to his feet, he faced Greyhawk squarely. "You have my word," Thomas said, his voice steady now. "The land by the river will be returned to your people. Just save my boy." A ripple of outrage surged from the settlers standing behind him. "You damn fool," one shouted. "You'd trade away all our futures for the sake of one child?" Another man barked, "He's fallen into their trap." Thomas spun, fury flashing in his eyes. "Would you say that if it were your son lying here?" His voice carried the raw power of desperation. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the shallow breaths of Jacob. Greyhawk nodded slowly, as if measuring the honesty in Thomas's words. "Your promise is made before your people and mine. If you break it, you will not only dishonor yourself, you will invite death to your settlement." With ritual care, Greyhawk unwrapped the bundle of herbs. He ground the roots with a stone, mixing them with water drawn from a skin. The air filled with the sharp, earthy scent of medicine older than memory. He knelt beside Jacob, pressing the mixture into the wound, then pouring drops between the boy's lips. The other Apaches watched in silence, their faces lit by firelight. To them, this was more than healing. It was a moment of power, a reminder that their knowledge could save where settler tools failed. Minutes stretched like hours. Jacob stirred, his breath deepening. His face, once ghostly pale, began to flush with faint color. The swelling eased, if only slightly, but enough to show the medicine was working. Thomas felt tears sting his eyes, though he forced them back. He had been ready to dig his son's grave, yet now, through the hands of his enemy, life flickered once more. Greyhawk rose and turned to Thomas. He will live if he rests and the venom is drawn out by the herbs. But remember your oath. Break it, and the desert will remember. Thomas nodded, the weight of his promise pressing like iron chains around his shoulders. Behind him, the settlers muttered in anger and fear, their faces twisted with distrust. Already Thomas knew the battle was not over. Saving Jacob had been the first cost. Fulfilling the bargain would be the greater test. As he lifted his son back into his arms, Thomas caught Greyhawk's eyes one last time. There was no warmth in them, only the unyielding strength of a man who had bound another to his word. The boy had been saved, but the true price of the remedy was only beginning to unfold. The ride back to the settlement was long, the desert wind cutting sharp against Thomas's face. Jacob lay cradled in his arms, weak but breathing stronger than before. The bundle of herbs Greyhawk had pressed into his hand weighed heavier than any sack of gold. It wasn't just medicine, it was a covenant. By dawn, they reached the wooden gates of the settlement. Men rushed forward, eyes narrowing at the sight of Apache medicine tied in leather pouches. Some muttered curses, others backed away as if it were witchcraft. But Thomas ignored them. He carried Jacob into the cabin, laid him on the bed, and with trembling hands prepared the next round of treatment, just as Greyhawk had instructed. The mixture was bitter, its scent sharp enough to sting the nose. Jacob grimaced as the liquid touched his lips, but he swallowed, his eyes fluttering shut. Thomas bound the herbs against the wound, watching anxiously as the angry swelling began to recede. For the first time since the snake struck, he dared to hope. Hours passed, then a day. Jacob's fever broke in the night, his body drenched in sweat. When the boy awoke, whispering, "Pa," with clearer eyes, Thomas felt his knees weaken. Relief poured through him like rain on parched earth. His boy was alive. But even in that moment of joy, the weight of Greyhawk's demand pressed against Thomas's chest. He remembered the fire-lit face of the medicine man, the steel in his voice. "Give back the land, or dishonor will follow. You." The settlers soon gathered outside Thomas's cabin. Word had spread of the bargain. Some came with anger in their eyes, others with fear. The settlement's leader, a grizzled man named Marshal Crane, stood at the front, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "You traded our river for your boy," Crane growled. "That land feeds us all. Without it, our crops fail. You gave away our lifeline." Thomas squared his shoulders. "I gave my word, and it saved Jacob's life. That land was theirs before we ever set foot here." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some spat in disgust, others shook their heads. Thomas knew then that his decision had driven a wedge between him and his own people, but the promise was made, and a man's word was not a thing to break. That night, as Jacob slept peacefully for the first time in days, Thomas sat alone by the lantern's glow. The herbs, the oath, the cure, all of it tied him to Greyhawk's demand. His boy was safe, but the future of the settlement now trembled like a wagon wheel on broken ground. The remedy had saved a life, yet it had also bound Thomas to a debt heavier than iron. Jacob's recovery brought relief to Thomas's home, but outside those walls, storm clouds gathered. The settlement was divided. Some families, grateful for the boy's survival, whispered that perhaps honoring the Apache demand might bring peace. Others spat the idea out like poison, swearing they'd never bow to their enemies. Marshal Crane fueled the anger. Standing tall in the town square, he thundered, "We've fought and bled to claim this land. Now one man dares to give it back, to hand it over like a coward's gift. If we surrender 1 acre, they'll take 100 more." His words struck chords of fear, and many settlers nodded in bitter agreement. Thomas, however, could not be swayed. He remembered Jacob's pale face, the rattlesnake's fangs, and Greyhawk's unflinching eyes. His promise had been made in front of both peoples. To break it now would mean betraying not only the Apache but his own honor. But standing alone against a community is no easy task. Neighbors who once shared bread now turned their backs on him. Some muttered curses when he walked past. Children whispered that Jacob had lived by savage magic. The weight of suspicion pressed heavy on his family. At night, Thomas's wife, Mary, sat by the fire, her hands trembling as she mended Jacob's torn shirt. "They'll drive us out," she whispered. "The others, they won't forgive what you promised." Thomas clasped her hand, his jaw set. "Better they curse me than bury our son. My word stands. The land will be returned." Days later, Thomas saddled his horse and rode back toward the Apache territory. Jacob, still weak but recovering, begged to come along, but Thomas refused. "This is my burden, son," he said firmly. The journey weighed on him. He knew the settlers might brand him a traitor, but his oath bound him more tightly than any chain. Reaching the Apache camp once more, Thomas found Greyhawk waiting. "You kept your boy alive," Greyhawk said, his voice calm but piercing. "Now will you keep your word?" Thomas nodded. "I will. But know this. The others may fight me. They will not surrender land easily." Greyhawk studied him for a long moment, then spoke. "A man's word is tested in the fire of resistance. If you fail, the poison will not only return to your house, it will spread to your whole people." The weight of those words settled deep in Thomas's chest. He had won his son's life, but the struggle ahead would test whether that victory meant anything at all. The boy had been saved. Now the man would be tested. The sun blazed high as Thomas rode back into the settlement, his horse kicking up dust that clung to his boots and hat. The ride from Apache land had been long, but his resolve had not wavered. He had promised, and he intended to keep that promise. When he dismounted in the square, the settlers were already gathering, their faces grim and their voices sharp. Marshal Crane stood at the front, hands crossed over his chest, his revolver glinting at his side. Thomas raised his voice so all could hear. "The boy lives. Greyhawk's medicine saved him. But the price has been named. The riverbank land must be returned." The crowd erupted like a storm. Women clutched their children, men shouted curses, fists shook in the air. "You'd sell us out to savages," one man spat. Another barked, "We worked that soil. We bled for it." Marshal Crane stepped forward, his face as hard as stone. "You gave your word, Thomas, but you had no right to speak for us all. That river is ours, and no Apache will ever claim it again." Thomas's jaw clenched. "I did what none of you could. I begged our enemies for help, and they gave it. My boy lives because I kept my word. That land was theirs before we stole it. I'll see it returned, whether you stand with me or against me." A tense silence followed. Some settlers lowered their eyes, ashamed by the truth in his words. Others growled in defiance, unwilling to yield. Jacob, still weak, leaned against the cabin doorway, his pale face watching his father stand alone against the fury of the crowd. That night, whispers filled the settlement. Some called Thomas a traitor, others called him a man of honor. But no matter the whispers, one fact remained. The riverbank was now contested ground. When dawn broke, Thomas saddled his horse once more, carrying a stake and a piece of cloth tied with an Apache mark. He rode to the riverbank, planted the stake in the soil, and tied the cloth high for all to see. It was a signal, not just to the Apaches but to his own people, that the land was no longer theirs. And with that act, the first stone was thrown into the water, sending ripples that would soon become a storm. The settlers did not take the surrender lightly. By midday, a dozen men rode out to the riverbank, rifles slung over their shoulders, anger burning in their eyes. They tore down the Apache cloth and trampled the stake into the mud. One man spat into the river, shouting, "This land's ours and no medicine man can take it back." But they were not alone. Across the water, shadows moved among the cottonwoods. Apache warriors, silent as the desert wind, watched every gesture. When the stake was ripped from the ground, a low, haunting war cry echoed across the river. The settlers froze, rifles twitching in their hands. From the trees, Greyhawk emerged, flanked by his warriors. His face was calm, but his eyes burned like embers. "Your man gave his word," he said, his voice carrying like thunder over water. "You dishonor him. You dishonor us. Is this how white men treat their promises?" Marshal Crane stepped forward, rifle raised, his voice dripping with venom. "A promise made under duress is no promise at all. We'll not surrender an inch. If the Apaches want a fight, they'll get one." The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of gunpowder and sweat. Thomas, arriving on horseback, pushed through the settlers to stand between the two sides. His face was grim, his voice steady. "Stop this madness. A word was given, and it will be kept. I won't let my son's life be stained with blood spilled over broken honor." But neither side trusted the other. The settlers accused Thomas of siding with their enemy, while the Apaches doubted whether any white man's word could be trusted. Tension exploded when a nervous settler fired his rifle into the air. In an instant, Apache arrows cut through the wind, thudding into wagon wheels and fence posts. Settlers scrambled for cover, shouting and firing wildly. The riverbank became a battlefield, its soil stained with fear more than blood. Thomas grabbed Crane by the collar, dragging him back. "This isn't the way. You'll damn us all." But Crane's eyes gleamed with the madness of pride. "Better damned than conquered," he spat. Greyhawk, standing firm even as chaos erupted, called out above the noise, "Honor the oath, or face the fire of war." The river roared between them, no longer a boundary of peace but the line of a coming war. Thomas knew then that saving Jacob's life had only been the beginning. The true poison was not the snake bite. It was the hatred festering in men's hearts. And unless he found a way to cure it, both peoples would be consumed. The riverbank standoff had left the settlement uneasy and the Apaches watchful. No blood had been spilled that day beyond scratches and grazes, but both sides felt war pressing close, like thunder waiting behind black clouds. Thomas knew the settlement could not survive an Apache assault. He also knew the Apaches would not forgive a broken oath. Trapped between his own people and the promise he had made, Thomas carried the weight of both worlds on his shoulders. That night, as the settlement argued in the square, Marshal Crane rallied the angry settlers with words sharp as knives. "Thomas chose his boy over us all," Crane spat. "He bound us with a coward's oath. Now the Apaches demand land, and tomorrow it'll be our homes. We stand and fight, or we die crawling." Some settlers roared approval. Others, weary of endless bloodshed, whispered that perhaps Thomas was right. The divide cut deep, neighbor against neighbor. At dawn, Thomas rode out alone to the Apache camp. Greyhawk met him at the edge of the firelight, arms crossed, eyes unblinking. "You've come to choose," Greyhawk said. Thomas dismounted, his voice steady. "I gave you my word. I will keep it, even if my people cast me out. The riverbank is yours. I'll stand against any who say otherwise." Greyhawk studied him in silence, then spoke. "Words are easy when spoken, but a man's honor is proved when his own tribe turns against him. Will you bear their hatred?" "I already do," Thomas answered. That night, Greyhawk summoned both Apaches and settlers to gather at the riverbank. Torches lit the water in a fiery glow. It was to be a council of judgment. Crane stood tall, rifle across his chest. "We'll not bow to savages. Thomas may kneel, but we won't follow." Thomas stepped forward, his son Jacob at his side, pale but standing strong. The boy's voice rang out, weak yet fierce. "They saved me. If my pa's word means nothing, then what? Does our word mean at all?" The crowd stirred. Even hardened men lowered their eyes. Greyhawk lifted his hand, silencing the murmurs. "The boy speaks truth. A word dishonored is a poison worse than venom. In that moment, the trial was clear. Thomas had chosen honor, even against his own people. Now the settlement had to decide whether to walk the same path or plunge into... Well, the night of the council became a turning point. Not every settler agreed. Some stormed away muttering curses, but enough laid down their rifles to let Thomas's promise stand. The riverbank, fertile and sacred, was returned to the Apache. Stakes were marked, fences pulled down, and for the first time in years the land flowed freely to its rightful keepers. It was not peace, not yet, but it was the first step. Marshal Crane, humiliated, left the settlement with a handful of bitter men. They carried their anger with them, vowing one day to return. Their departure left the settlement smaller but quieter, like a wound beginning to heal. Jacob's recovery became a symbol. He was the boy who lived because an Apache's knowledge had triumphed where settler medicine failed. Around campfires, whispers grew. Maybe the gap between the two peoples wasn't as wide as it seemed. Thomas bore scars of his choice. Some settlers still called him traitor, others treated him as a man of honor. But when he walked through the settlement with Jacob, at his side he did so with his head held high. He had made a promise and kept it even when the cost was nearly everything. Greyhawk, too, carried the memory. Around his fire, he told his people, "The white man Thomas is not like the others. He knows that a word is life. His boy will grow, and his people may yet learn." For him, the remedy given that night had been more than herbs and roots. It was a chance to test whether honor still lived among those who had taken so much. Years later, when Jacob was grown, the story of the snakebite and the bargain was still told. Children of both settler and Apache blood listened in awe. Some saw it as a warning about the cost of broken promises, others as proof that enemies could find respect through honor. The land by the river flourished again, its soil feeding Apache, families as it once had before fences divided it. And though skirmishes still flared in other parts of the frontier, here at least, there was a fragile thread of trust woven through years of mistrust. In the end, the true remedy had not only been for the poison in Jacob's blood, it had been for the poison of hate and pride that festered between two peoples. One life had been saved, but the greater cure was the lesson left behind, that promises, once made, were not to be broken. And so, the story lingered, carried on desert, winds and river currents, of a father who kept his word, an Apache who tested it, and a boy whose survival became the seed of something larger than any one man. The poison had been cured, but the remedy became a legacy.